Welcome to episode 1 of the Filmmaking Through Music Podcast. I'm your host, John Wader, and my mission is to help you as a filmmaker, videographer, producer, have a more appealing film or project through the effective use of emotional music. In this episode, we're going to cover the topic that actually inspired me to do this podcast in the first place, and it is the only 3 things, in my opinion, that you must absolutely cover when you're kicking off that relationship and conversation between a director and a film composer. And spoiler alert, none of those 3 things are actually talking about music, right? This is about those early conversations when you're getting to know someone for the first time. Maybe it's your first time working with them as a director or as a composer. But really, it's important to me that projects get started and focused on storytelling and filmmaking elements. And those are the kind of the things that I want to dive into today. These 3 components are really in my opinion, the foolproof system that's going to let you make sure that you're on the right track, right? It's making sure that you're hitting the foundational elements before really diving into the nitty gritty and the more creative parts of the score, right? I think the opposite of this topic is just kind of like going at it without a plan, or just grabbing stock music from a library, or just asking a friend to write some music for your film, or just saying, hey, I trust you, just go for it. I see a lot of films that might go that route, and it's very clear, I think, from the audience's point of view, and other filmmakers' point of view, that maybe some corners were cut there. So again, the purpose of this is to really make sure you're focusing on the professional and best way to approach original music and score for your film. I always say the analogy that if you have a couple of shots or frames or footage in your film that doesn't look absolutely pristine, or it's a little too shaky, or it's a little too dark, audiences typically look past that, right? But when it comes to the music and really the sound and audio as a whole, those are the kind of the dead giveaways when something isn't right? When the music or the score just doesn't make sense, or if it feels reused or generic. Those are the things that more typically and more likely are going to get your audience out of the world that you're trying to build, and you are trying to have them in this immersive world. So that's what we're trying to avoid here. We're trying to keep them in the immersive world. We're trying to let the audience feel that emotion and empathize with the characters. We don't want them to be distracted or pulled out because of the mistakes of using more generic music or licensed music, or not having a proper film scoring approach to it. You don't want the music to your film to be associated with what is associated with the libraries, right? It's cheap, it's fast, it's accessible, it's convenient. Anybody can use it. So you don't see a Hollywood film score being reused across the board. It's created bespoke to that project because it's inherent to that project. It doesn't exist in the world without that story, without that film, right? When you're going for licensed music, with vocal songs, it's different because you're using it for purpose, right? Because there's lyrics or it has a meaningful value to it. But when you go for that licensed music in your film, you have to realize that anybody in the world can do that same thing. But when you hire a film composer to create music for that scene, it is 100% original, tailor-made to that specific character, on that arc, in that scene, at that setting, at that time. And it doesn't exist in our world without that film, right? So, if you're an independent filmmaker and you're seeing films out there thinking to yourself, like, why isn't my film as successful as that? Or I could do that. You have to ask yourself, well, what do they have that I don't, right? Are they getting a 10 out of 10 on every part of their production, or are they cutting corners, right? I learned this analogy, right? Like 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times 0 is still 0. And so if you get a 5 out of 5 for, writing, directing, acting, and then you get a 0 on your music, your film is still, a 0 there. So, math analogy there, but you get the point. You're a filmmaker and you understand that every part of that filmmaking process needs to support the story that you're telling. And that extends to the music is there. And again, it's not to say that there isn't a home and place for stock music and things of that nature, especially with more like maybe vlogging or more like corporate commercial type things. But again, it's about, bringing on a specialist in music composition for film to be a part of that storytelling team. Your film is going to have a higher commercial appeal to the general public. The audience is going to say, like, oh, okay, this is a legit film score. They're not messing around here. No matter how hard you try with pulling in existing music into your film, you're going to have a more narrative alignment when someone is creating music specifically for that. So let's get into those big 3, right? The 3 things that you need to focus on when getting started in that composer-director relationship. Again, not music. That's probably the 4th thing. But number 1, it's story. 2 is tone, and 3 is vision. Story is obviously number 1. Tone and vision, you can flip-flop back and forth as 2 and 3, right? They all have some overlap, of course. Okay, first one, story. It all starts there with what is the narrative, right? Because you have to remember that the music of a film is meant to be this piece of glue across the story of your film. And so the first conversation isn't about, well, what kind of music do you want? It's what's the story you're telling? And your composer's job is to think about, okay, how can I help tell that story musically? What's that narrative arc? What do I need to support here? What do I need to foreshadow here? What do I need to go against the grain? Who are my characters? What are the palettes? What are the different tones of music and different styles of music that I need to create to support your story in film? You want to understand the deeper meanings, right? Is your story, are there allegories or metaphors or things of the nature that are in your film that we need to think about musically in order to support those? It goes without saying, but I'll mention it. Make sure you're sharing your script with your composer as well, assuming that you're hiring them earlier on. Topic for another day, but do not hire your composer 3 weeks before your first festival deadline. You want to start bringing your composer on earlier on, one, to lock up their time, but let them get immersed as well. Again, that goes more into the sort of ways of working, which we'll dive into in a future episode. Number 2 is the vision for your project. And that goes with the creative vision and the more professional goals, professional vision with it as well, right? So like, what is the overall plan for the movie? What do you want the perception to be of this movie? And then you answer the question of, well, how can music help? How can music help fulfill that vision? How can music help support that vision? With the vision, I think you go into more things like inspiration and references. I love seeing like a shot deck from my filmmakers as well. Like, show me your stills. Like, show me the color palette that you're looking for. That has such a huge influence on the type of music that you're going to want for your film, right? And that really feeds into number 3, which is tone and mood. That's more of the shot deck elements, more of the color palette and those types of things, because that's your perspective on the story that you're telling. Are you framing this in a dark and cinematic way? Are you framing this in a light and airy way? What is your opinions on what the story is that you're telling on screen? And the big one that's threaded throughout all those is the emotions, of course, right? Like, no matter when you're talking about story, when you're talking about a vision, when you're talking about tone and mood, the emotions that come across in all of those elements is always going to be paramount. It's always about what emotion do you want your audience to feel when they're watching this scene or this. And I want to go into why aren't we talking about music right away, right? You're hiring, a music composition specialist for this film. So why are we not, talking about music right away with them? It's because those musical conversations will come out, right? They come through the thread of story, vision. You want to trust that your composer understands, again, your story, the tone, the mood, and the vision, and the goals for their project first and foremost, right? The composer's job is to be able to write the music. So when you're meeting with a professional, you have to, if they aren't a professional film composer, they might not be capable or able to creating whatever music is needed. But you want to partner with somebody that is a filmmaker at heart or a fan of film at heart, and not just somebody that can create good music. But we don't talk about music right away because, again, as a composer, I want to understand all those things from you, right? Moods, tone, story, and vision, because those help inform the decisions that we're going to make and collaborate on together for that film score itself. And the other huge part of that is, right, like, I don't want to bog you down or confuse you with musical jargon. So that's actually even a red flag when you're meeting with a composer if they're overly talking musically, right? The invitation's always there. I understand that there are many filmmakers that are, musical. So if you're able to talk the language or you want to talk the language, I will happily do that with you. And you'll hear this from bigger name, filmmakers and composers, but you got to focus on the emotion in the story. You might have an idea or a vision of what you want for this score, but even just talking about the influences of music is often enough, right? It's like, the question sometimes is, what film score that already exists in this world could you see working in your film? And sometimes that's a really great question in a thought experiment that I ask film directors to just give me an idea where their head's at, right? If there was, we weren't worried about budget or we weren't worried about timeline, what could we make? And so I really do like that. That starts bleeding on to also a conversation about temp music, which I'll tee up myself for another episode on the ups and downs of temporary music in film. I want to keep this first episode rather short. I talk about all of these roles and initial conversations between composer and director, and that mood, tone, story, vision, and goals. I talk about all of those in a free playbook and interactive website that I put together for filmmakers. So you can click the link around this video or in the podcast, and you can just grab that via email. And it's just a landing page that has prompts and tiles and things you can click into and things you can save your notes in there. And it's just kind of my way of bringing a little extra value to you all as filmmakers when you're getting understanding, working with composers and figuring out the music for your film for the first time. Thanks so much for listening, and happy filmmaking.